Chapter 4 is about retributive justice. The chapter begins with a reminder about the difference between distributive and retributive justice. So whereas distributive is how resources are fairly distributed in a society, retributive justice is about the violation that is committed by a criminal and the attempt to devise a response or a punishment. So it has to do with responses to harm. Chapter 4 begins with, again, important questions like most of these chapters. What is a crime and how do you define it? What constitutes punishment? And on page 66, there are 5 elements that constitute punishment that are described. The traditional philosophies of punishment are deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, and social defense. And when you download your PDF lecture notes for this chapter, you will see there's areas around the terms where you can note important points about each one. So I won't go into the definitions of them in this lecture, but you can go from pages 67 to 69 and note the aspects that are important. After that, the book goes into this idea of battle model versus family model of punishment and retribution. The main point to understand about these two, and under battle model, there are a few different kinds, and the one that we are most familiar with for our society is due process model. The main points to understand about the differences is that battle model, the outcome is to separate, categorize, compartmentalize, and often stabilize the identities. So for instance, once someone has committed a crime, they are labeled a criminal and they are categorized as a criminal, and that stays with an individual for the rest of their lives. And depending upon the crimes, the repercussions differ. For instance, a person can lose the ability to even function within the society, like the right to vote, depending upon whether you committed a certain type of crime or not. A family model is different. Specifically, the family model is about whether we can treat each other differently and remember that we are first a person, a human being, rather than a criminal. On page 77 of the book, it says that in the family model, when a child is punished by a parent, each knows afterward that they will continue to live as before. So that is a key difference. When your child does something wrong, yes, there is a consequence and there is a punishment, but for the most part, your child will always be your child. And that child, the whole responsibility of what happens is to learn to do better and to be better. The child will always be the child first and foremost. And so the question arises, can we as a society even contemplate this formula or this model? And at the bottom of page 77, or kind of halfway in the book, there are some points that the authors bring up regarding a family model concept. And the first thing is that faith has to exist with your public officials, and we as a society must feel that our public officials act in good faith. And if we have been following what is going on in society, there is not a lot of good faith with our political officials and others that represent and are supposed to be doing good for the entire nation. So already we can't even get step one complete here. Second, it defines that new roles for the defense counselor should include how the attitudes are approached with your person that you are representing, ideas of cooperation, constructivity, and conciliatory behaviors. And then the most important is that attitude of the respect for rights, dignity, and individuality. So a person, an offender, is first and fundamentally a person rather than categorized as a criminal. So already you can see our society isn't necessarily set up for this family model of justice. I do want to point out a little further back when I was talking about the due process models and in general the different versions of battle models. There was a version called Actuarial Justice. And on page 74, it talks about false positives at the bottom. A false positive is a person who has been predicted to be dangerous in some way, but turns out not to be so. And false positives are definitely things that happen and occur in society right now in terms of the way groups of people are viewed. For instance, if you are out late at night and you're a person of color, sometimes your body and your existence is viewed with suspicion. And that could be a false positive when there is no danger and there is no threat. The same is true with the way children are treated when things don't go, quote, the right way in school, and the student is blamed for that. And then this attitude exists about who they are and what they can actually contribute to society. So these are issues that we are dealing with as a society when we're thinking of a type of justice system that is in place for our society. And as the chapter continues, it ends with this notion of restorative justice, which is actually very similar or very powerful, especially considering the next chapter of transformative justice. And you will find out that our end book, Transforming Communities, deals a lot with restorative justice or transformative justice. And Is Everyone Really Equal as well deals with some notions even in chapter 2 regarding restorative justice. So there's going to be some overlap between the chapters. So restorative justice is something I'm very familiar with from my own research within Chicana and Chicano studies, and especially one of my favorite theorists that is discussed here, which is Foucault on page 78. And again, that name and that idea is mentioned in chapter 2 of Is Everyone Really Equal? So there are 5 elements to restorative justice at the bottom of 79. And in your PDF notes, I actually did not include these 5 elements. Instead, I included the 4 attributes to a successful resolution that are discussed on page 80, because I felt like that was more important. But I will highlight the 5 elements to restoration right now. The first one is, of course, a meeting between the offender and the victim. The second is each person expressing a narrative of what has happened from their perspective. The third aspect is emotion. Both groups are allowed to feel anger, hurt, pain, whatever happened. It caused some kind of an emotion in each person. Then there is the understanding. So how do we empathize with each other, and even the victim empathizing with the offender, which is very, very difficult to do if you are the party that has been harmed or hurt. And then you end with some kind of an agreement in which a resolution is attained. And that is the part that I focused on in the PDF slides. Those aspects are an apology, saying I am sorry for having wronged or hurt someone, behavioral change, restitution, and generosity. And the book describes that in detail. One thing that's important to understand about restorative justice is that in order for it to work, it has to be voluntary. You can't force an offender to feel something they don't feel. And you can't force a victim to confront their offender, the offender, without, them wanting to. So it's voluntary, which can make restorative justice a little difficult, because in terms of what crimes we are talking about, some are more forgivable than others. For instance, someone spraying graffiti on a business's building and it upset the business owner, that kind of a crime isn't as extreme as a murder or something regarding sexual abuse. The chapter has 2 more important concepts before it ends that I want to draw your attention to. On page 82, at the bottom, it discusses the difference between equity and equality. That discussion will come up again in the book, Is Everyone Really Equal? And there is a distinction between equity and equality. The book uses an analogy. Equality is everyone has a pair of shoes. In society, we make sure every person gets their pair of shoes. Everyone is equal in that regard. However, equity is that everyone's shoes actually fit their feet, and everyone's shoes is appropriate for the types of labor and work they need to do. So rather than saying, oh, well, everyone has the same pair of shoes, we're equal, equity looks at individual scenarios that changes whether equality is actually possible or not. So someone who works in construction would need construction work boots versus someone who does a lot of basketball playing might need basketball shoes. Another concept, which is the last concept actually, is this notion of passive versus active responsibility. Passive responsibility is when one person holds another person responsible for certain activities. Active responsibility is the virtue of taking responsibility for putting things right. And I like to highlight this because it's very easy to say, I'm not racist. I didn't cause all these problems that are happening in society. It's that person's fault, or it's that person's fault. It's easy to place the blame on someone else. However, if you take active responsibility, rather than saying, I'm not a racist, you begin to practice anti-racist attitudes. So you self-reflect and you look at, what can I do to be actively anti-racist? And in your PDF notes for this lecture and this chapter, I did include Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, as an example for this active responsibility that more and more individuals and institutions are taking to have a stand against injustice. If you have any questions about this chapter, please reach out via email.